Hey everyone, this is Michael Reineman from The Mind of Christ, Christianity for a Modern Age. If you're new here, this channel explores what I call inner Christianity, biblical interpretation, spiritual experience, and practical living, all in the context of the ancient Christian wisdom tradition. I'm so glad you're here. Today's topic, the exchange, exploring sexual zeitgeist. There may not be a more pressing issue today facing the church and society as a whole, and that's the issue of sexuality and gender. So how on earth are spiritual people supposed to navigate these realities that we face in our day-to-day? So I want to break down today what I consider the key spiritual dynamics of human sexuality. And we're going to do that by taking a passage in Romans 1. We're going to break it down. And then we're going to zoom out again, and I'm going to give you some practical suggestions. Before we really dive in, I want to encourage you to interact with this content, especially something like this. Leave a comment below, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I want to encourage you to check out our resources that we have on the Mind of Christ website. Those links are in the description. So this is a topic I've actually wanted to do a teaching on for a while, but it's just quite inflamed. It's quite sensitive. It's something that it's like politics. When people hear it, immediately emotions come up, and it's very hard to kind of remain calm, rational, and clear-headed around this because it carries a lot of emotional charge and baggage. That's just the reality. I want to mention that this video is a little bit longer than my typical teachings, and that's because something like sexuality is quite complex. So we're just going to scratch the surface in this video, but I want to encourage you to hang around to the end because I do think that the information I present here is very worthwhile and helpful. So I'm teaching on this now, even though I've been hesitant to, because I think now is the time that we need it most. It's really hard to find good teaching on this topic. The church tends to be quite dogmatic, so we hear these Bible verses and we're just told this is the way things are, this is the Bible verse. And that doesn't really help us. There's not enough wisdom on this topic. Wisdom goes beyond a Bible verse. Wisdom goes beyond knowledge. Wisdom is enlightenment from God that comes through personal experience, personal exposure. So for your sake, I'm going to share a little bit of what I've learned from navigating my own subconscious world. And humbly, I'm going to do my best to offer wisdom, which again is integrated knowledge that comes from God's enlightenment and personal experience. So generally speaking, we know what the Bible says about sexuality and different forms of sexuality. This is not a mystery, especially if you've been in Christianity for a while. However, as I said, in real life, this topic is not black and white. And this is because whether we will admit it or not, a lot of us wrestle internally with our different sexual issues and brokenness. And that's something we're rarely honest about. We're rarely honest about it because we fear shame, we feel condemnation, and the reality is there's not a lot of people who are doing their inner work and can be a safe place to process some of these issues. Or, which I see a lot, is we're simply not aware of our inner reality. We're not really aware of what drives our ideas of sexuality or gender or our own desires, and we prefer just to judge or condemn based on what we see in our experience from other people. I'll state a lot in my teaching, in my coaching. All of us are capable of things that we don't feel like we could ever fall into. All of us are capable of sexual brokenness. All of us are capable of straying into areas or going down paths that we never thought possible. It's just a matter of the right time, circumstances, and pressure. So we have to be really careful not to judge others. We haven't walked their path. We don't know where they've been. And you don't know for sure for when that trial comes for you. You don't know how you would handle it. You have to stay humble. So sexuality and gender is a very complex issue, and we can be quite ignorant, we can be quite reductive, we can be quite judgmental, and this really harms us in the long run because it prevents us from understanding both ourselves and others. And we should always seek wisdom and understanding first before we speak out of an ignorant or uninformed opinion, and that's just good life advice in general. So let's jump right into our analysis on this very famous passage of sexuality. This is from Romans chapter 1. I think if we take the time to understand this, we can actually gain some insights into both our personal and collective sexuality. And the word zeitgeist in the title, that's kind of this prevailing collective mindset that kind of dominates our age, zeitgeist. That's why I use it. So this is a bit of a longer passage, but we'll read it first to get a general overview, and then I'm going to break it down. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. This is Romans 1:18 through 19 and 21 through 23. So some key points I want to highlight here. We have this present ongoing revelation of the wrath of God. We see this right away. And what I want to say is, despite what this looks like on the surface, this isn't about God raging against us like an alcoholic father, okay? This is a manifestation in our experience of the consequences of living out of alignment with God's spiritual design, which is the divine image in man, the inner Christ. So this wrath of God is the consequence of living out of alignment. And this is mental delusion or illness. This is sin. This is sickness, and ultimately death in mind, body, and spirit. The next point is from this passage is knowledge of the truth of God that Paul is saying is put off here. So this knowledge here, this is an experiential, integrated knowing of God through union with God in mind, body, and spirit. Because again, remember, all humans are made in the image of God through Christ. It says that in Hebrews and Colossians. So awareness of this reality is in our nature. And this passage states that awareness of this truth about the inner divine image is being, quote unquote, suppressed through wicked behavior. The third point, rejection of glory. So Paul says that despite having the intuitive awareness of God and knowledge of the truth of the divine image, humans have not glorified God. So glorifying God, this isn't about praying before bed or going to church on Sunday and lifting up your hands or going to Bible study. Glorification of God is about radiating the glory of the divine image so that we can manifest the life and power of God in mind, body, and spirit. That's to glorify God, to walk in that image, to radiate that image. In other words, it's walking in God's reality rather than our own self-created reality so that the power of God can unfold in our experience. The poisoning of the human heart and mind. The heart being our subconscious reality, and the mind being our thoughts and imagination. And this is what behavior outside of God's design does to us. We lose awareness and consciousness of God's reality and walk in an illusion. It's false, it's illusory, it's not real, it's a false reality. We lose awareness and consciousness of God's reality. And lastly, there's the exchange. There's where we get that word for the title of this teaching. There's the exchange of spiritual reality for sensual illusions, and Paul calls this images. And this is, again, where the title of the teaching comes from. It's in this process of giving ourselves over to sensual illusions, there's an exchange of some sort. And the exchange is the giving over of our thinking and our desires to sensuality and pleasure, and ultimately the spiritual forces that operate behind these desires. Basically, we lose a grip on God's reality, and essentially we become insane from heaven's point of view, and we find ways to rationalize our behaviors that gratify our pleasures. And these rationalizations can become actually quite intricate and complex, and although we can think of ourselves as wise and intelligent, our minds are really just a slave to the unconscious desires of our heart. Okay, before we continue, you might be wondering, okay, well, maybe all of this doesn't apply to me. You know, I've never had issues with my sexuality. I've never had a problem with lust. And that's where it's very important to understand that there's a spiritual law. And that spiritual law is that the individual and the collective or society, we're all intricately connected. And there's a passing down of certain patterns or inclinations through the generations. In other words, all of us have to navigate the complexities of living in a world of lust. So while we may not, and I understand that there's multiple viewpoints on this, while we may not inherit sin, we do inherit certain inclinations, especially from our father. A father struggling with lust and promiscuity, that's going to lay a foundation for the next spiritual generation. So lust and its different expressions tend to compound through the generations if they're not addressed and dealt with through spiritual process. Very difficult truth to accept. Put it very simply, we all inherit a spiritual deck of cards from the generations preceding us, and we have to use wisdom to learn how to play our hand. It sounds very unfair. It sounds very not right, yet it's reality. It's a truth. And we have to understand that some of our inclinations, especially when we're young, that's not necessarily our fault. You know, a righteous young woman who's dealing with the shame of conflicting sexual attractions have to understand that, again, this isn't necessarily something she contributed to on her own, but she can learn to play her cards well. She can find life, peace, power, and freedom. That may not come easily, but in wrestling with God, that's where true spiritual growth happens. And in that struggle, we put on the divine life in mind, body, and spirit. The other issue that everyone has to face is that we navigate an extremely oppressive sexual culture. We're absolutely drowning in sensuality, our entertainment, when we walk outside, and these are the principalities and powers. These are the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly realms that Paul talks about in Ephesians 6. We have to contend with those beings. So no matter where you may be in your own personal journey with lust or sexuality, your victories and failures will influence the spiritual destiny of those around you, especially your children. That's another sobering reality. The level we reach is the platform for the next generation. So let's all be praying that we raise that bar. By the way, if you're enjoying this teaching and the scriptural analysis and want to dive a little bit deeper, I recently completed a commentary, an ebook on the book of Romans, and in it we dive deep into Paul's letter. We go verse by verse, and we explain what may be very complex spiritual realities in simple language. If you're interested in that, there's a link in the description. So let's move on to the rest of this Romans passage and pull some more key points. This is verse 24 through 28. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their heart to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged, again, there's the idea of exchanged. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done. So the key points I want us to understand here, this giving over we see repeated multiple times here is the same thing as the revelation of the wrath of God mentioned earlier. So simply put, God allows us to have power and freedom, and in this freedom we can take the path towards light or darkness. Our soul is like a garden. The seeds we water will grow. The seeds we water with our thoughts and behaviors will grow, and the others die. And this is because ultimately our thoughts shape our reality. And this is a statement that can sound very new age to evangelical Christians, but it's an undeniable spiritual truth that can actually be witnessed in our experience. In verse 25, we again see the idea of exchange. The exchange is the truth, glory, and power of the divine image in us for lust, which can indeed bring us pleasure in the moment, but will always leave us wanting more and more and more. If we give lust an inch, it tends to take a mile. Maybe you can relate to that. And we have to understand that pleasure is part of God's reality, but when it's divorced from God's wisdom, it's an incredibly powerful illusion, and it hijacks our senses, and it has us believe in false truths. And this is going to influence the whole human system, mind, body, and spirit. Our reality becomes dictated by our senses rather than God's reality, which is the kingdom of God. Paul's making the point here that lust, given space to grow in us, it's going to eventually manifest in expressions of homosexuality. The expressions we can very clearly see in this passage. And this is because, spiritual truth, through generations, the spiritual force of lust is constantly and aggressively seeking deeper and deeper gratification and expression. Proverbs says that the fire of lust never says enough. So we reach a point with this through the generations that Lust grows so much, it's never stopped, it's never put off through spiritual experience, growth with God, the fire of God, and it develops and grows into what is homosexuality, gender dysphoria. The overarching point I want to make about this passage is that our sensual and bodily experiences have to be paired with the truth and wisdom of God. When we lose our groundedness or our connection to God's reality, we get deceived. We get taken over by pleasure, and we believe in lies that find their power in pleasure. John calls this the lust of the eyes and the lusts of the flesh in 1 John. Paul will continue to say in this passage, we're not going to break it down, but Paul will continue to say that depravity doesn't know any bounds because, again, it's constantly seeking gratification. And at the end of this passage, it says that those trapped in the illusion of lust invent ways of doing evil. And if we have any exposure to our current social sexual landscape, you know some more extreme examples of where our lusts and our predilections for evil desires can take us. And here's the hard truth. Sexual pleasure that is divorced from the presence and wisdom of God, from divine law, it's going to block the inflow of spiritual life that is available to us through the inner divine image in mind, body, and spirit. This is why the Romans passage emphasizes a penalty. This is sickness and disease in both mind and body. This is also why Paul in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 10, he says that those who engage in homosexual behavior cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And this is because behavior that is divorced from God's presence serves the lie of pleasure, and it darkens our mind from receiving enlightenment and wisdom from God. So if there's no power of God in our minds, if there's no truth and enlightenment of God in our minds, there's no power of God in our bodies and our experience. And again, that's because our thoughts have the power to dictate and shape our reality. So once we give ourselves over to the lie, once we give ourselves over to that pleasure or that gratification we may feel through behavior that's divorced from God's wisdom, that's when our thinking also shifts to rationalize what we're doing. So our mind becomes a slave to the subconscious, to what's going on in my heart. Proverbs 14:12 says there's a way that seems right to a man, so it might seem right here, but in the end it leads to death. The scriptures call this idolatry. I read about this idea of idolatry more extensively in my first book, The Mind of Christ. So how do we make this analysis or this overview of this passage practical? You know, maybe you're a parent whose 14-year-old son just came to you and he says he thinks he's gay. What would you do? What do you do? And again, I will say that we need to acquire not only some knowledge about this topic, but more importantly, wisdom. And wisdom isn't simply speaking Bible verses over yourself or someone else to try to change yourself. That's not going to be enough. It might be a tool, but it won't be enough. Maybe you identify as heterosexual or homosexual or somewhere in between. Well, the truth is that everyone has to be given the freedom to have their own journey with God and their own process, because God has a unique plan for everyone. So we need to understand that everyone is going to have their own journey with this. But we need the power of God in our experience in mind, body, and spirit. We need to obtain wisdom for ourselves by wrestling with God. And it's in that wrestling, in that struggle, that we often find unique answers or spiritual solutions that we need the most to continue growing, to continue inheriting the kingdom of God. God says to Hosea in Hosea chapter 4, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." So, in other words, lack of awareness, lack of understanding. This can bring death and decay into our experience in mind, body, and spirit. So we have to obtain deep self-knowledge. We have to obtain enlightenment through spiritual process. And this is something that I write about and teach about often. So when I was an adolescent, I had no idea how to access enlightenment. I had no idea how to access the transformative power of God and God's presence in my life. And I can remember the first time when I was very young, I saw an adult image on a computer screen. And it was a complete accident, but it opened me up to this kind of dark path, which I followed, and it just became deeper and deeper and more twisted. And maybe you can relate to that. But the point was, as a kid, I saw something that felt good. Even though I knew it was wrong, it felt good. And once something feels really good, the mind will find a way to rationalize and get us to see it again or do it again. So even though I was a child, I was allowing these lustful seeds to take root in my heart, and I was watering them through my behaviors. It's very easy to do that in a digital age. As we saw in this passage, it took hold of my rationality, and I just kept going. It went deeper and deeper, and I saw things and I did things that I knew were not in alignment with God's truth or wisdom, and I had no idea how deeply these things would impact me later in life. So even though I eventually stopped watering these certain seeds, things that are planted in the soul tend to remain. And the enemy can then use that against us. It can be tormenting. There can be condemnation. There can be judgment. And I needed that revelation of God's love, power, presence to really move forward. And I talk about this process in my first book, The Mind of Christ. This process of uprooting and replanting, it can actually be extremely difficult. It's difficult mentally. It's difficult emotionally. It's difficult spiritually. So if you can, start now walking in the power and presence of God. If you know you're in a behavior that's not in alignment with God's reality, it's best to get out of that now, because we're just going deeper and deeper, and those seeds are being watered, and it's taking an even deeper hold on our mind and our soul. So given that we've taken a quick look at that Romans passage, given that I've shared a little bit, I want to give some practical suggestions for navigating the complexities of our modern sexual landscape. And I do want to state, although it may be very unpopular, a foundational truth is that everyone has to be given the freedom to live their lives as they desire. This is a core principle of spiritual freedom. This is a core principle of God's love. We have that freedom. So we have to acknowledge that certain people are going to think and behave differently than us, and that doesn't mean we need to agree with them, but that's the beauty of freedom which God gives to us. So in other words, we have to find some sort of peace. We have to find peace with attention in society, in ourselves, because we spend an enormous amount of energy trying to change other people and wish that our modern times were different. And that's not what God's asking us to do. God's asking us to do our own work, to walk our own path, and to keep moving forward. So today we can witness in the church what some people, particularly homosexuals, call gay panic. And this is the intense social and political response, usually from traditional religious communities, about the rising manifestation of LGBTQIA advocacy, tolerance, legislation. And I will say that, at the end of the day, there's really not much we can do about that, except to continue walking in the wisdom and enlightenment of God for ourselves. And although it's difficult to navigate these issues of sexuality and gender, it's not new to mankind. This is a wave. It's going to manifest and it's going to eventually pass. And it may take time for that and cost us as a culture, but it will pass. And usually the societal and political reinforcement of depravity and darkness, it's usually a strong indicator that a culture is at the end of its pinnacle. And the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis actually serves as a reminder of that truth. It's timeless. It's a timeless truth. When we start to see these things manifesting into our collective experience, there's great change that's about to happen. God has to shift us back into alignment. So what we can do is trust what the scriptures actually say, and that's that God is going to bring his correction and his discipline and his power in his timing. And the best thing we can do is to live in alignment with God's design by being immersed and empowered and filled with the Spirit of God. And this can help us make very wise decisions as we navigate our current sexual zeitgeist. Another very important point I want to make is that our sexual brokenness, both personally and collectively, our sexual brokenness, our collective darkness, that has to manifest in our experience before we can partner with God to address it and bring power and enlightenment. We can't really do anything that's hidden. We can't do anything about something that we're not consciously aware of. Paul says in 2 Thessalonians that the man of sin must manifest before Jesus can come to bring healing, restoration, and renewal. And this may be uncomfortable for some of these, you might think are, shadow elements to manifest out of us or out of the collective society, but it's a truth. These things have to come up and out. Jesus says that nothing that is hidden will stay hidden. Everything is going to be revealed. And I've watched people get completely swept up into this issue, and they start shaping their lives around fighting this issue. And while there may be definitive times to stand on truth, there's also a time to use discernment and wisdom. Ecclesiastes says that there is a time for war and there's a time for peace. And we need to learn how to navigate an issue like this with grace and wisdom. We have to be able to discern the times. So maybe you're someone who is struggling with your own sexuality, or you have a loved one, or you have a child, or you have a parent who is, and I would say that this is actually more normal to the human experience than we think it is. But the church has very little teaching, wisdom teaching on this beyond dogma. right? Dogma being this is right, this is wrong. Sometimes we can be led to think that this is a very unusual experience, but the Bible says that there's no temptation that is not common to man. There's nothing that cannot be overcome. And we forget that Jesus Christ was tempted in absolutely every single way, but remained without sin. And Christ was subjected to all these temptations during his early ministry so that he could advocate and eventually empower us all. And the implication from the scriptures is that Christ experienced the spiritual pressure of all sexual darkness and depravity. So he understands what we're going through in our sexual struggles, no matter the situation. And there's always going to be the grace. There's always going to be the wisdom. There's always going to be the empowerment. There's always going to be exactly what we need. And that is a stunning truth that brings so much peace and hope. So people hide their inner struggles for fear of judgment or condemnation. And my recommendation, and what I recommend to those people who I coach, my recommendation is to pray about finding a safe, wise, spiritually enlightened person who you trust, who can actually come alongside you and help you with your own journey with God. And we have to open ourselves to the power of God in our experience. We have to pray for that. We have to want that transformative power of change, of movement, of growth, of freedom from blockages, of freedom from lies. And I promise that in whatever wrestling you may or may not be doing, you're going to find exactly what you're looking for, but you have to keep moving forward. You have to keep going. So much more can be said about this issue, but this teaching is a good start for understanding our collective sexual zeitgeist, which is the defining spirit or mood of our present age. And we don't often hear teaching about some of these spiritual dynamics of human sexuality beyond the dogma. So that's what I was trying to do in this video. So if you've benefited from this message, the best thing you can do is to like this video, share this video, leave a comment below. Maybe you agree, disagree. Share this videos on your socials with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel. Check out the resources in the description. We have books, we have Bible commentary, we have spiritual coaching. Again, those links are in the description. So again, this is Michael from the Mind of Christ. I'll see you soon.